Hi everybody. In this little recording, we're going to look at the portion of the axial skeleton that is the costa and the sternum. Remember, when we look at the skeletal system, you have 206 bones in the skeletal system, and we divide them up into two groups. If you are a bone that's found in what we would call the body, you're a part of the axial skeleton, and if you're a bone of the appendage, your arms and legs, you're part of the appendicular skeleton. Now in this video, we're going to look at the costa, which are your ribs, and the sternum, which is commonly called the breastbone. So again, with the axial skeleton is made up of what you would consider the bones of your body to be. So we have the cranium, the bones of the skull, we have your vertebra, we have your ribs, we have your sternum, and what's called your hyoid bone. In this video, we're going to focus on what you would call your chest or your rib cage. Now we're going to start off with the sternum, and the sternum is what you commonly call your breastbone. Now when I am in class, I use the anatomy coloring book by Caput. The one that I have has pictures of the skull on the front. You might have a different version. I have the 4th edition, but in my coloring book, you can get a lot of this information on page 28. If you have a different anatomy coloring book by Caput, it's labeled Skeletal and Articular System, the Bony Thorax. The thorax is what we call your chest region, and it contains your heart, it contains your lungs, and it's protected by what you call your rib cage. Well, in the case of your sternum is commonly called your breastbone, and it is actually 3 pieces that have fused together. Now, in the case of bones, we do take bones, we divide them up into 4 different categories. Your sternum is a member of what we call a flat bone. Remember, flat bones tend to curve a little bit, and you can see here from the side view how your sternum does curve inward, and these get longer due to intramembranous ossification. So in the case of your sternum is actually 3 different pieces that have suture together. And the top portion of your sternum, right here, as you can see, is called the manubrium. The second portion is commonly called the body, but it actually has a real name. And I want you to know the real name. And it is called the gladiolus, just like a gladiator. And you guys know my writing on these things are not the best. The gladiolus is the main section of your sternum. And then the tip down here at the bottom is called the xiphoid or the xiphoid process. So these are the 3 different pieces that come together to form your sternum or your breastbone. Now the term manubrium means handle. Because remember, ancient people might have used the sternum of an animal, and the way that a real sternum is, you can very easily tie a rope or a stick around this portion of this bone and make something like a spear. Or you can actually hold it in your hand at the manubrium and you've got yourself a knife or something. The term gladiolus means to pierce or knife. That's where gladiators get their name from. And the gladiolus is that long, skinny portion that's in the middle. And then down at the bottom, you have the xiphoid process. Now, for those of you who know CPR, you know you're not just supposed to start immediately pressing on a person's chest. You're supposed to find the tip and work your way up. Well, when you find the tip, you're feeling for this part right here. And then it tells you to go 3 fingers upward and then place your palm. So you tend to place your palm in this area right here. You don't want to just automatically start CPR, because if you do it in the wrong place, you can actually break these sutures. And the last thing you want to do is to break this suture right here, because the way that the sternum points inward, if you're to break off the xiphoid process as you're doing compressions, you could actually pierce that person's heart or maybe their lungs. So that's why, for those of you who know CPR, you're supposed to do it that way. But the sternum is what we commonly call the breastbone. And again, it is made up of 3 different parts. You have the top part, which is called the manubrium or the handle. You have the middle portion, which is the gladiolus, not the body. We're not going to use the term body, it's the gladiolus. And then you have the very, very end, which is the xiphoid process. It is a flat bone because you can see how it curves. And along it, it has different facets. Now, if you remember, we talked about things called fossas and condyles. And a condyle is anywhere 2 bones come together to form a joint. And if it's like a little socket where things kind of click into place, that's often called a fossa. Well, in the case of your sternum up here, you have what's called the clavicle notch. Okay? That is an example of a condyle. You would find articular cartilage there, and that's where your clavicle, which remember is your collarbone, articulates with your sternum. Then down the sides, you have what we call costal notches. These are also examples of condyles because it's where a joint forms. It's got hyaline cartilage in there. It's also an example of a fossa because it is a little socket. Okay? But this is where your ribs articulate with. So speaking of ribs, which we commonly call your costa, let's look at your rib cage. So you can see here your sternum and its three divisions, the manubrium, the xiphoid process, and remember we're not going to use the term body, we're going to use the term gladiolus. And you can see how the ribs wrap around and articulate with the sternum. Now, you have 24 ribs. You have 12 pairs of ribs, and they articulate, remember articulate means to form a joint. They will articulate with vertebra in the back, and they will circle around towards the front. Now, in the case of your costa, all ribs articulate with a vertebra. All of your ribs will form a joint with a thoracic vertebra. You have 12 thoracic vertebrae, you have 12 pairs of ribs. And the ribs will articulate in your back with thoracic vertebra, and they will circle around to the front. Now, depending on how they circle around, this is how we divide our ribs up into three parts. Now, as science has gotten better, we have changed the names of some of these ribs. In your coloring book, you will see true ribs, you will see false ribs. You also see true ribs and false ribs in this diagram. These are what we call the common names, but they're not the correct names. And what I mean by that, if you see the term true rib, that makes you think, okay, this is a real rib. If you see the term false rib, it makes you think, okay, this isn't a rib. Right? That's why we try not to use the terms true ribs and false ribs anymore. Okay? The real name, the correct name for your true rib is a vertebrosternal rib. Now, what this means, if you'll notice, we have vertebrosternal ribs, vertebrochondral ribs, and we have vertebral ribs. All ribs articulate with a vertebra on the back. That's where the first part of the name comes from. Vertebrosternal ribs connect to your spine. Vertebrochondral ribs connect to your spine. A vertebral rib connects to your spine. So that is your clue that all ribs connect, form a joint with vertebra, your spine. How they wrap around is where the second half of the name comes in. In the case of vertebrosternal ribs, these are ribs 1 through 7. If you'll notice in this picture, when they wrap around, they connect to your sternum with cartilage. Remember, all of this in here, let me pick a different color. All of this in here is hyaline cartilage. Okay. We need that hyaline cartilage so that our chest can compress and expand in order for us to breathe. Well, in the case of the vertebrosternal ribs and the vertebrochondral ribs, these terms are, how does this wrap around? In your true ribs, which are ribs 1 through 7, or your vertebrosternal ribs, when they wrap around, the cartilage directly lines up with the sternum. Okay, even rib number 7 directly lines up with the sternum. Right? So vertebrosternal ribs, they articulate on one side with the vertebra, and they articulate on the other side and line up directly with the sternum. In the case of vertebrachondral ribs, they still attach to the sternum. However, they don't directly attach to the sternum. Notice with ribs 1 through 7, every rib 1 through 7 lines up, attaches to the sternum. Okay, so a direct attachment to the sternum. In ribs 8, 9, and 10, these are what we call vertebral chondral ribs. They attach to the vertebra on one side, and they still attach to the sternum on the other side, but they attach indirectly. They attach to cartilage. Remember the root word chondro means cartilage. So notice here in this picture, when it attaches to cartilage of number 7. This attaches to the cartilage of number 8. This attaches to the cartilage of number 9. Now, they still attach to the sternum, but they do so indirectly. So with your vertebral sternal ribs, these pieces of cartilage directly attach to the sternum. That's where they get their name from. Okay. In the case of vertebral chondral ribs, these indirectly attach to the sternum. They attach to cartilage first. So it goes from the vertebra, it goes from the vertebra to cartilage, vertebra to cartilage. Right? So vertebral sternal ribs go from the vertebra and directly attach to the sternum. Vertebral chondral ribs go from the sternum and then indirectly attach to the sternum by way of cartilage. That then leaves ribs 11 and 12. 11 and 12 are what we call your floating ribs, or just your vertebral ribs. Notice there's nothing they connect to. Vertebral sternum goes from the vertebra to the sternum. Vertebral chondral goes from the vertebra to cartilage. Then we just have vertebral ribs. These are your floating ribs. These do not come all the way around the front of your body. And these are actually smaller. They are shorter than your other ribs. These are ribs 11 and 12. They do not wrap all the way around your body. They do not attach in any way to your sternum. And these are there to help protect your kidneys. So here's a side view. Here's a side view that shows you how it works. Okay. So you can see the sternum in the front, and your true ribs are ribs 1 through 7, and their real name are your vertebral sternal ribs. Your false ribs are ribs 8, 9, and 10. Their real name is your vertebral chondral ribs. And your floating ribs are ribs 11 and 12, and their real name is your vertebral ribs. Now, in the case of your ribs are examples of irregular bones, flat bones. They are flat, they're skinny, and they curve. And with a flat bone, our rib cage got bigger, if you remember, through intramembranous ossification. They do not have growth plates. But with your ribs have 2 ends to them. Okay. Down here on this side, that flat end, that's where this would attach to cartilage. So this is one of the ribs, numbers 1 through numbers 10. So this flat edge would have cartilage, and then it would attach somehow to the sternum. This portion back here is the portion that articulates with your vertebra. So remember, we have a facet. A facet is the same thing as a condyle. This is a flat area that's going to be covered with cartilage where 2 bones articulate or come together. We also have this tubercle. A tubercle is another feature we talked about. Remember, a tubercle is a bump on the bone. It's usually there for muscle attachment. So this is how everything comes together. So as you can see, in the case of your ribs, we have all these pieces of cartilage and ligaments and tendons covering our rib cage. But you can see here ribs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 are in this picture. And you can see how the rib articulates with the cartilage, and then the cartilage attaches to the sternum. This second picture, picture B, shows you how the ribs articulate with your vertebra. So here I have a rib. Here's a rib right here. It's going to line up with the vertebra right here. That is one of our articular facets. And then it also will line up with a portion of the vertebra right here. Okay. And so when you eat ribs, you are probably eating a section, they've probably cut a section of the spinal cord, and you've got the meat going off of that. But remember, when we talk about ribs, we have our true ribs, which are ribs 1 through 7. They are our vertebral sternal ribs, and those are the ribs you're seeing in this picture. So they articulate with the sternum on one end, and they wrap around, and they line up and attach to the sternum on the other end with cartilage. Ribs 8, 9, and 10 are commonly called your false ribs. Their real names are your vertebral chondral ribs. They wrap around. They also attach to the sternum, but they attach indirectly. They will attach to the cartilage of number 7. So they're vertebral chondral ribs. And ribs 11 and 12 are your floating ribs. They're also called your vertebral ribs because they articulate on one side with the vertebra, but they do not wrap all the way around and join the sternum on the other side.